Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of America's most romanticized criminal underworlds. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to be a mobster in New York during the Mafia's golden age, roughly 1950 to 1990. But forget the images of honorable gangsters living by codes, family loyalty conquering all, and stylish criminals outsmarting bumbling police. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us to New York City, when the five families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, controlled vast criminal empires worth billions. This isn't the Hollywood version of wise guys in expensive suits making witty banter and living luxurious lives. This is the reality. The constant paranoia that your best friend might be ordered to kill you. The violence that was casual and brutal rather than cinematic. The FBI surveillance that never stopped. And the understanding that your own organization would eventually betray you, because betrayal is the business model. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there is another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's walk into a social club in Brooklyn and discover what it really meant to be a made man in the New York Mafia. If you were born into an Italian-American family connected to organized crime in the 1950s or 60s, your path toward becoming a mobster might have seemed natural, even inevitable. The neighborhood where you grew up, maybe Bensonhurst in Brooklyn, maybe Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem, maybe Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, was place where everyone knew which families were connected and which weren't. The men who dressed well, drove nice cars, and commanded respect, despite having no visible legitimate employment, were made men. Members of La Cosa Nostra, literally, this thing of ours. Your father might have been a mobster, or your uncle, or your godfather, in the literal, not cinematic sense. You grew up seeing these men as successful and respected, at least within the insular Italian-American community. They had money when others struggled. They had influence when others were powerless. They protected their own and punished those who disrespect. To a young man in a working-class neighborhood with limited legitimate opportunities, the life looked appealing. What you didn't see as child was the violence, the paranoia, the inevitability of prison or death, and the fact that most mobsters weren't wealthy, but rather middle-class criminals constantly scrambling. To become a made man, you first had to be an associate, someone who worked for the family without being officially inducted. If you were an associate in your late teens or early 20s, you did whatever work the family needed. You might have been a driver, running errands and transporting people. You might have collected debts for loan sharks, intimidating people who owed money. You might have worked in one of the family's legitimate businesses, construction companies, waste management, trucking, which were fronts and money laundering operations as much as actual businesses. The work was often boring and sometimes dangerous. You spent a lot of time waiting for instructions, waiting to hear if a deal went through, waiting to see if someone would pay what they owed. The excitement that movies portray was rare. Most days involved sitting in a social club playing cards, gossiping, waiting for something to happen. The social clubs, dingy storefronts with card tables, espresso machines, and men sitting around, were headquarters where family business was conducted. But they were also just places where men killed time. The violence that associates were expected to participate in wasn't dramatic shootouts, but ugly beatings and intimidation. If someone owed money and wouldn't pay, you might be sent with 2 or 3 other guys to beat them up. Not kill them, because dead people can't pay, but hurt them enough to motivate payment and warn others. You punched people, hit them with bats, broke bones. The victims weren't rival gangsters, but often ordinary people. Shop owners who couldn't make extortion payments, gamblers who lost more than they could pay, people who'd offended someone connected. The violence was business, conducted matter-of-factly, and you were expected to do it without hesitation or visible emotion. To prove yourself worthy of being made, you generally had to commit a murder. This wasn't universal requirement, but it was common. The family wanted to know you could kill, that you wouldn't hesitate when ordered, and that you'd be complicit in murder, so you couldn't testify against them without implicating yourself. The murder might be a sanctioned hit, killing someone the family wanted dead, or it might be proving you could kill by participating in a hit with made men. Either way, your willingness to take a life was test of loyalty and nerve. The actual experience of committing murder for the first time was nothing like movies portray. You were nervous, probably terrified. Your hands shook. Your heart pounded. When you pulled the trigger or swung the weapon, the reality of taking human life, the blood, the sounds, the finality, was traumatic, even if you'd convinced yourself it was necessary or justified. Some associates couldn't do it and washed out of the life. Others did it and lived with guilt, nightmares, or psychological damage. A few seemed unbothered, which might have made them valuable to the family, but also marked them as sociopaths. The making ceremony, when you were officially inducted into the family, was ritualistic and secret. You were called to a location, maybe a basement, maybe a private room in a restaurant, where made men gathered. Your sponsor, a made man who vouched for you, presented you. The boss or underboss presided. Your finger was pricked and blood drawn. You held a burning image of a saint, usually St. Francis, and swore oaths of loyalty, secrecy, and obedience. You were told that La Cosa Nostra came before everything, before family, before God, before your own life. You swore to never betray the organization and accepted that betrayal meant death. The ceremony created a bond. You were now a made man, a friend of ours rather than a friend of mine, the distinction that indicated membership status. You had formal rank in the family hierarchy. You couldn't be killed without permission from the boss. You were entitled to earn and to respect from associates and other made men. But you were also now bound by rules that constrained your life and subjected you to the arbitrary authority of bosses, who could order your death for violations real or imagined. The earning that made men did, generating money for themselves and the family, took many forms. The traditional mafia rackets in New York included gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, extortion, hijacking, and drug trafficking, despite official prohibition against drugs that was widely ignored. If you were a made man, you might have controlled gambling operations, bookmaking, numbers running, illegal casinos. You took bets, paid winners, collected from losers, and kicked up a percentage to your captain and the family administration. Loan sharking, lending money at usurious interest rates, was lucrative and simple. You lent money to people who couldn't get legitimate loans. Gamblers in debt, businessmen desperate for capital, people with bad credit. The interest might be 2 to 5% per week, compounding to annual rates of 100, 250%. If borrowers couldn't pay, they went deeper into debt, sometimes being forced to commit crimes for you or turn over their businesses. The violence was implicit threat that made the system work. Everyone knew what happened to people who refused to pay. Labor racketeering involved controlling unions and using that control to extort businesses and steal from union funds. The Mafia controlled several unions in New York, especially in construction, trucking, and garment industry. If you were a made man with union connections, you might have taken bribes from contractors in exchange for labor peace, embezzled from union pension funds, or run no-show jobs where the union paid salaries for workers who didn't exist and you pocketed the money. This was sophisticated white-collar crime that generated millions with less risk than street crime. The construction industry in New York was thoroughly infiltrated by the Mafia. The Concrete Club, a cartel of concrete companies controlled by the families, rigged bids on major construction projects, inflating costs and splitting the excess among themselves. If you wanted to build in New York in the 1970s and 80s, you paid mob taxes, whether you knew it or not. The World Trade Center, Trump Tower, and countless other buildings were built with mob-inflated concrete. The costs were passed to developers, landlords, and ultimately to everyone who lived or worked in those buildings. The drug trade was officially forbidden by the Commission, the ruling body of the five families, because drugs attracted federal attention and harsh sentences that might make members cooperate with authorities. But the money was too good to resist. Many made men were involved in heroin and cocaine trafficking despite the official prohibition. If you were caught, the family might disavow you, claiming you violated the rules and they had no responsibility. But if you were earning well and kicking up generously, your involvement would be overlooked until it became politically necessary to punish you. The daily routine of a made man wasn't glamorous. You woke up late, maybe 10 a.m. or noon, since much business was conducted at night. You had breakfast at a diner where you met other mobsters and discussed business over coffee and eggs. You spent hours at the social club, the real office where decisions were made and orders were given. You collected money from your various operations, visiting bookmakers, meeting with loan shark clients, checking on hijacking fences. You had dinner at an Italian restaurant, often a place where the family had a piece of ownership or where the owner paid tribute for being allowed to operate. The restaurants where mobsters congregated, Rouse in East Harlem, Sparks Steakhouse, various places in Little Italy, were more than just food establishments. They were meeting places, negotiation sites, and sometimes killing grounds. The waiters knew not to interrupt certain conversations. The owners knew to provide back rooms for private meetings. The atmosphere was one of power and implicit threat. Civilians ate there, knowing that the men at nearby tables were gangsters, which added to the restaurant's mystique, but also created constant tension. The money you earned as a made man was variable and often less than movies suggest. A successful made man might earn $200,000, $500,000 annually in the 1980s. Comfortable middle-class income, not the millions that movies portray. The flashy lifestyle, expensive clothes, jewelry, cars, was partially financed by credit and loans, not necessarily by vast wealth. You needed to project success to maintain respect, even if you were sometimes struggling to make payments. The pressure to maintain appearances while kicking up to your captain and the family administration meant that many mobsters lived beyond their means. The FBI surveillance was constant and increasingly sophisticated. If you were a made man in the 1970s and 80s, you assumed you were being watched. The FBI had agents dedicated to organized crime who knew the family structures, who the made men were, and where they congregated. They photographed you entering and leaving the social club. They followed you to meetings. They interviewed your neighbors, family, and associates, not necessarily to gather evidence, but to let you know they were watching and to pressure people around you. The wiretaps and bugs were pervasive. The FBI had learned that mobsters were careful on phones, talking in code, using payphones, avoiding incriminating statements. So they planted bugs in the social clubs, in cars, in homes. The Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, where Gambino boss John Gotti held court, was so thoroughly bugged that the FBI recorded thousands of hours of conversations. The mobsters knew about some bugs and conducted important conversations while walking outside or with the radio turned up loud. But they didn't know about all the bugs, and eventually their own words convicted them. The paranoia about informants was just, there were informants everywhere, and you never knew who they were. The FBI cultivated informants through various means, threatening prosecution unless they cooperated, offering money, exploiting personal grudges, or simply finding people who were disillusioned or afraid. An informant might be a made man, an associate, a girlfriend, a lawyer, or anyone with access to information. You couldn't trust anyone completely, which created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and isolation. The internal politics of mob families were Byzantine and deadly. Each family had hierarchical structure, the boss at the top, an underboss as second in command, a consigliere as advisor, captains, capos, who commanded crews, and soldiers, made men, who did the earning and the work. But this structure was constantly unstable. Captains plotted to become underboss. Underbosses plotted to overthrow the boss. Ambitious soldiers undermined their captains. Every relationship was transactional and potentially treacherous. If you were made man in the 1970s or 80s, you lived with awareness that you could be killed at any time if you were perceived as disloyal, if you earned too much and didn't kick up enough, if you disrespected someone more powerful, or simply if killing you served someone else's ambitions. The murders within families were often over petty disputes, personal grudges, or power struggles that had nothing to do with business. You could be killed for an insult, for sleeping with the wrong woman, for being too close to someone who fell out of favor, or for no reason that anyone ever explained to you. The mob wars that erupted periodically in New York were extremely dangerous, even if you weren't directly involved. The Colombo family war in the early 1990s saw drive-by shootings, ambushes, and killings that left about a dozen dead and many more wounded. If you were a Colombo soldier, you had to choose a side, support the boss or support the rebel faction, and whichever side lost would likely see its supporters killed or imprisoned. The mob war wasn't romantic battle for honor, but ugly internecine killing, where men who'd worked together for years suddenly became enemies because their superiors had fallen out. The famous hits that became part of mob lore were usually brutal and often involved betrayal by people the victim trusted. Albert Anastasia, boss of what became the Gambino family, was shot to death in a barbershop chair in 1957, killed while he was vulnerable and relaxed, probably on orders from people he considered allies. Carmine Galante, acting boss of the Bonanno family, was shot while eating lunch at a restaurant in 1979, ambushed by men who'd been invited to dine with him. Paul Castellano, Gambino boss, was shot outside Sparks Steakhouse in 1986 in a hit organized by John Gotti. Castellano, his ambitious how mob politics worked. Castellano was legitimate boss, but he was aloof. He favored white-collar rackets over traditional street crimes, and he'd alienated some of the family's captains. Gotti organized a conspiracy of captains who wanted Castellano dead. On December 16, 1985, as Castellano arrived at Sparks for a meeting, 4 men in identical trench coats shot him and his bodyguard to death on the street. Gotti watched from a car parked nearby. Within weeks, Gotti was the new boss, having murdered his way to the top, violating the rule that bosses could only be killed with commission approval, but succeeding because he had enough support within the family. If you were one of the shooters in a hit like Castellano's, you were a disposable tool. You were promised reward and advancement for doing the killing. But you also knew too much. You could testify about who ordered the hit, who planned it, who was involved. You were a potential witness who might cooperate with authorities if caught. The people who used you to commit murder had incentive to eventually kill you to eliminate that risk. Many mob hitmen were themselves murdered years later by the same people who'd employed them. The drugs that many made men became addicted to weren't just commodities they trafficked, but also personal demons. Cocaine use was common among mobsters in the 1970s and 80s. It was available, it provided energy and confidence, and the lifestyle involved late nights and stress. But cocaine addiction made you unreliable, paranoid, and likely to make mistakes. If your captain learned you were using heavily, you might be ordered to stop. If you couldn't stop, you might be killed as a liability. The same drugs that generated profits also destroyed many mobsters. The gambling that mobsters engaged in, often while they ran gambling operations, was sometimes ruinous. It's darkly ironic that men who made money from others' gambling addiction were themselves often degenerate gamblers. You might have bet on sports, played cards for high stakes, or gambled at casinos. If you lost more than you could pay, not uncommon, since gambling addiction doesn't respect income, you were in debt to other mobsters, which created complications. How do you collect from someone who's made? How do you pay when you're supposed to be earning? The internal tensions over gambling debts led to resentments and sometimes violence. The legitimate businesses that mobsters owned or controlled were often poorly run despite generating income. If you owned a restaurant, a construction company, or a waste management business, you might have treated it as a cash cow to be milked rather than a business to be developed. You hired incompetent cronies, you stole from the business, you used it for money laundering or fraud. These businesses often failed or barely survived, not because the market was bad, but because the owners were criminals who didn't know how to run legitimate enterprises and didn't care as long as they extracted cash. The IRS was sometimes more dangerous than the FBI. The federal government had learned from Al Capone's case that they could prosecute mobsters for tax evasion when they couldn't prove other crimes. If you were earning substantial unreported income, you were vulnerable to IRS prosecution. The IRS looked for red flags, expensive lifestyle without reported income to support it, large cash transactions, property and assets that couldn't be explained by declared income. Some mobsters tried to hide their wealth, others claimed gambling winnings or inheritance. But maintaining the illusion of legitimate income while living well on criminal proceeds required constant vigilance and often failed. The women in mobsters' lives, wives, girlfriends, daughters, had complicated positions. If you were a mob wife, you knew or suspected what your husband did, but were expected not to ask questions or acknowledge it directly. You enjoyed the money and status, but lived with fear that he'd be killed or imprisoned. You raised children who would grow up in the same environment, possibly following their father into the life. Some mob wives were complicit, hiding money, lying to authorities, even participating in crimes. Others were victims, trapped in marriages where leaving would mean losing financial support and possibly facing retaliation. The mistresses, gumas in mob slang, were common. If you were a successful mobster, you likely had a girlfriend in addition to your wife. This was accepted practice, almost expected. You set up your mistress in an apartment, supported her financially, spent time with her that you didn't spend with your family. This created complicated emotional and financial entanglements. Some mobsters genuinely loved their mistress and resented being trapped in traditional marriages. Others saw mistresses as status symbols or conveniences. The arrangement worked until it didn't, until a wife found out and caused problems, or a mistress demanded more than you could provide, or the relationship became known to authorities and created vulnerabilities. The children of mobsters grew up in strange environment. If you were a son of a made man, you knew your father was connected, but might not understand exactly what that meant until you were older. You saw him command respect in the neighborhood, saw FBI agents watching your house, saw your father arrested periodically. You might have been proud of his status or ashamed of his criminality. Some sons followed their fathers into the life. It was familiar, it seemed natural, and they had connections that made entry easier. Others rejected it, went to college, pursued legitimate careers, changed their names to escape the association. The RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, was designed specifically to prosecute organized crime by targeting entire organizations rather than just individual crimes. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge people with racketeering if they were part of criminal enterprise and had committed 2 or more predicate crimes. The penalties were severe, up to 20 years for each RICO count, plus asset forfeiture that could strip defendants of everything they owned. RICO transformed mob prosecutions in the 1980s and 90s, leading to convictions that previous laws hadn't enabled. The Mafia Commission trial of 1985-86 used RICO to prosecute the bosses of the 5 families simultaneously, charging them with being part of the commission that directed organized crime. The prosecution called mob turncoats as witnesses, presented wiretap evidence, and detailed decades of crimes. The convictions sent bosses to prison for effectively life sentences and demonstrated that no one was untouchable. For mobsters watching the trial, it was clear that the old rules that bosses rarely faced justice no longer applied. The decision to become an informant was personal calculation involving self-interest, fear, and sometimes genuine remorse. If you were arrested facing life in prison, the government offered a deal: cooperate fully, testify against your former associates, and receive reduced sentence and witness protection. The alternative was dying in prison. Some mobsters chose prison in silence, maintaining omertà, the code of silence, even at personal cost. But increasingly in the 1980s and 90s, mobsters chose cooperation. The incentives were too strong and the penalties too severe to maintain loyalty to an organization that would abandon you anyway. Henry Hill, whose story became the movie Goodfellas, was associate, never made since he was half Irish, who turned informant in 1980 after being arrested for drug trafficking. His testimony helped convict dozens of mobsters. He entered witness protection, lived under assumed name, and struggled with the isolation and loss of identity that came with leaving the mob life. His story shows the aftermath of cooperation. You're alive and out of prison, but you've lost your entire identity. Your family may disown you. Your former associates want you dead, and you live in permanent exile from everything you knew. Sammy the Bull Gravano was perhaps the most damaging mob turncoat. As John Gotti's underboss and a made man who'd participated in 19 murders, Gravano was deeply embedded in Gambino family. But he became convinced that Gotti was going to make him a scapegoat to save himself. In 1991, facing life in prison, Gravano agreed to cooperate. His testimony was devastating. He detailed the inner workings of the Gambino family, described murders he'd committed and witnessed, and directly implicated Gotti in multiple crimes. Gotti was convicted in 1992 largely on Gravano's testimony and sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 2002. Gravano's cooperation showed that even the highest-ranking made men would betray the organization when their self-interest demanded it. The mystique of omertà, the unbreakable code of silence, was revealed as myth. When faced with life in prison, loyalty evaporated for many mobsters. Gravano himself received only 5 years in prison, despite admitting to 19 murders, then entered witness protection. He later violated his agreement by returning to crime, running ecstasy ring in Arizona, and was convicted again, showing that some criminals couldn't leave the life even when given opportunities to do so. The prison experience for convicted mobsters depended on where you were sent and who else was there. Federal prisons had significant mob populations, many mobsters from different families serving time together. If you were doing a sentence in the 1980s or 90s, you might have found yourself with fellow mobsters who maintained the hierarchies and rules even inside. Made men commanded respect from associates even in prison. Business continued. Gambling, loan sharking, even ordering hits on people outside could be arranged through visitors and corrupted guards. But prison also exposed you to dangers from other criminals. If you were known mobster, you might be targeted by other inmates looking to make a name, by members of other organized crime groups, or by people you'd victimized who ended up in the same prison. The violence in prison was sometimes more brutal than on the streets. Stabbings, beatings, murders happened regularly. You had to maintain respect through force or allies, and any sign of weakness could be fatal. The psychological toll of the mob life became apparent as mobsters aged or were imprisoned. The paranoia, the violence, the betrayals, they created PTSD-like symptoms in many mobsters. You might have nightmares about people you'd killed. You might have become hypervigilant, unable to relax even in seemingly safe situations. You might have turned to alcohol or drugs to cope with stress and guilt. The mob life looked glamorous from outside, but living it meant chronic stress, constant danger, and psychological damage that many carried for the rest of their lives. John Gotti was perhaps the most famous mob boss of the era, but his flamboyance ultimately destroyed him and damaged the Gambino family. Gotti loved media attention. He dressed impeccably, spoke confidently to reporters, and cultivated image as Dapper Don. He beat several prosecutions in the 1980s, earning the nickname Teflon Don because charges didn't stick. But his high profile attracted intense FBI attention. The bugs in the Ravenite Social Club captured Gotti discussing crimes, criticizing other mobsters, and generally providing evidence that prosecutors used to convict him. Gotti's vanity violated traditional mob wisdom that bosses should be invisible and avoid attention. The old-school bosses, men like Carlo Gambino, lived modestly, avoided media, and conducted business quietly. Gotti's opposite approach satisfied his ego, but made him a target. After his conviction, many mobsters privately criticized him for bringing unnecessary heat on the families. His son, John Gotti Jr., later said that his father's celebrity was a mistake that cost him his freedom and his family their father. The decline of the New York Mafia beginning in the 1990s was caused by multiple factors: RICO prosecutions that imprisoned leadership, informants who undermined omertà, FBI surveillance that penetrated the families, and generational changes that made the life less attractive to young Italian Americans. If you were made in the 1990s, you entered a diminished organization facing constant prosecution and internal betrayals. The families continued to exist, but were weakened, less organized, and less powerful than they'd been in their mid-century peak. The younger generation of Italian Americans had opportunities their fathers and grandfathers hadn't had. College education was accessible. Discrimination against Italian Americans had decreased. Legitimate careers were possible that provided good income without the risks of mob life. The social prestige that mobsters once had in their neighborhoods had diminished. They were now seen as criminals rather than men of respect. The cultural factors that had funneled young men into the mob were weakening, and recruitment became more difficult. The other ethnic organized crime groups, Russian, Albanian, Chinese, Latin American, competed with Italian mafia for territory and rackets. These groups were often more violent and less constrained by traditional rules. If you were Italian mobster in the 1990s and 2000s, you faced competition from criminals who didn't respect the old arrangements and who were willing to escalate violence in ways that attracted attention. The monopoly on organized crime that the five families had once enjoyed was broken. The modern remnants of the New York mob families still exist, but are shadows of their former power. The families continued to have made men, to conduct traditional rackets like gambling and extortion, and to maintain some presence in construction and waste management. But they're heavily surveilled, frequently prosecuted, and struggling to earn. If you were made today, you would enter an organization that's been decimated by prosecution, that has difficulty recruiting, and that generates far less money than previous generations earned. The reality for modern mobsters is that prison is virtually inevitable. The surveillance is too thorough, the informants too common, the prosecutions too sophisticated. If you become a made man now, you're likely to spend significant time in federal prison. The question isn't if you'll be arrested, but when and for how long. The romantic notion of mob life has been replaced by stark calculation. Is the income and status worth the near certainty of imprisonment? The comparison between mob life as Hollywood portrays it And the reality is stark. The Godfather movies show a family-oriented organization with codes of honor where violence is purposeful and betrayal is rare. Goodfellas is more realistic, showing the casual violence, the mundane criminality, the paranoia. But even it romanticizes aspects of the life. The reality was dirtier, more boring, more paranoid, and ultimately more tragic than movies convey. The victims of mob violence and criminal activity are often invisible in mob narratives. The small business owners who paid extortion for debt, the workers whose union pension funds were looted, the neighborhoods terrorized by mob violence, the legitimate businesses destroyed by mob competition. These victims paid the real cost of mob activity. The focus on mobsters themselves, their internal drama, their personalities, their codes, can obscure that organized crime caused massive harm to ordinary people who had no connection to the life. The toll on mobsters' families is also often overlooked. The wives who lived with fear and uncertainty, the children who were embarrassed by or traumatized by their father's criminality, the relatives who were drawn into the life or suffered by association. These family members were victims of the mob life too. Some families were destroyed by the arrests, the violence, or the shame. Others maintained loyalty despite everything, standing by imprisoned relatives and maintaining connections even when it would have been healthier to separate. The money that seemed like the point of mob activity was often ephemeral. You might have earned well in your prime years, but the lifestyle meant you spent freely. When you were arrested, legal fees consumed savings. Asset forfeiture took property the government could trace. If you cooperated, you entered witness protection with little money and no way to earn in your former manner. If you stayed loyal and went to prison, your family struggled financially. The few mobsters who actually accumulated and preserved wealth were exceptions. Most ended up with little to show for years of crime. The physical toll on mobsters' bodies from the lifestyle was severe. The stress, the rich food, the alcohol consumption, the tobacco. Many mobsters developed heart problems, diabetes, cirrhosis, and other stress-related conditions. The violence left some with permanent injuries. The prison years aged people prematurely. You might have looked vital and successful in your 30s and 40s, but by your 50s and 60s, you looked and felt decades older. The life consumed you physically as well as psychologically. The regrets that imprisoned or retired mobsters expressed varied. Some maintained that they'd do it all again. They had no regrets. The life was what it was, and they accepted the consequence. Others expressed profound regret. They'd wasted their lives, hurt people unnecessarily, destroyed their families, and gained nothing lasting. The regrets often came too late, when you were already in prison, when your family was estranged, when your health was broken. The time to reconsider was before you were made, but by then the life's logic had already captured you. The code that supposedly governed mob life, the rules about loyalty, respect, proper conduct, was selectively enforced and often violated. The rules existed and were invoked when convenient, but they were also ignored when they conflicted with self-interest. You couldn't kill a made man without permission, except when you could, if you had enough support. You had to kick up to your captain, except when the captain was too weak to enforce it. You couldn't cooperate with law enforcement, except that hundreds did. The code was real in that it shaped behavior and justified actions, but it was also mythical in that it was routinely violated without consequence when power dynamics allowed. The question of whether mob life was ever truly honorable is debatable. The mobsters themselves often believed they followed a code that made their criminality different from and superior to common criminals. They took care of their neighborhoods, protected their own, and operated by rules. But this self-perception was largely self-serving rationalization. The honor was honor among thieves, loyalty within a criminal organization that existed to exploit others. The neighborhoods they protected were often the ones they victimized. The rules they followed protected themselves and their interests, not any higher principle. The glamorization of mob life in popular culture has real consequences. Young men romanticize the lifestyle based on movies and end up in prison or dead. The reality of mob life, the violence, the paranoia, the betrayals, the inevitable bad endings, gets lost in the cinematic portrayals. Even movies that try to show the dark side often can't help making it look appealing. The clothes, the cars, the respect, the camaraderie, these surface attractions obscure the nightmare. The FBI agents who spent careers investigating the mob developed complicated relationships with their targets. You spent years surveilling the same mobsters, wiretapping their conversations, following their movements. You came to know them intimately, their habits, their personalities, their families. Some agents developed respect for certain mobsters despite being adversaries. Others maintained pure professional antagonism. The relationship between the FBI and the mob was symbiotic in weird way. They defined each other, justified each other's existence, and engaged in constant game that both sides sometimes seemed to enjoy. Bite the stakes. The specific personal stories reveal the human reality behind mob statistics. Joseph Joe Dogs Iannuzzi was Gambino associate who became informant and wrote about his experiences. His account shows the mundane criminality, the small scams, the petty disputes, the constant need to generate income that characterized much of mob life. He wasn't a boss or famous hitman, but an average participant in organized crime, and his ordinariness makes his story representative of most mobsters' experiences. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, Lucchese underboss, was one of the most violent and paranoid mobsters in New York history. He participated in dozens of murders, betrayed allies, and eventually cooperated with the government only to have his cooperation agreement revoked because he lied repeatedly while supposedly helping investigators. Casso's story shows the extreme end of mob brutality. He was a sociopath whose violence went beyond even mob norms. He died in prison in 2020, having spent decades in isolation, a cautionary tale of how the most feared mobsters often end up alone. Vincent Vinny Ocean Palermo was acting boss of the Cavalcante family, the real Sopranos. The show was loosely based on his family, who became informant in 1999. His cooperation helped dismantle his own family. Palermo's decision showed that even bosses would betray their organization's life in prison. The De Cavalcante family story also showed that smaller families outside the five families operated similarly, but with less sophistication and more vulnerability to prosecution. Michael Francese, Colombo captain, who was involved in massive gasoline tax fraud scheme, eventually left the mob, became Christian, and now speaks about his former life. His story is unusual. He left the life without becoming informant, though he provided some information to authorities, reconciled with his family, and created new career. He presents his story as redemption narrative. Though critics note he continues to profit from his mob past through books and speaking engagements. His story raises questions about whether anyone truly leaves the life or whether the past always remains part of identity. The neighborhood's social dynamics in areas where mob was strong shaped everyone's lives. If you grew up in Bensonhurst or Howard Beach in the 1970s, you knew which families were connected. You knew which businesses paid tribute. You knew that certain men commanded respect regardless of their legitimate employment. This knowledge was transmitted culturally. Kids learned it from watching adults, from overhearing conversations, from the way people behaved around mobsters. The mob's presence shaped the neighborhood's culture in ways that were both oppressive and, to some residents, comforting. The legitimate businesses that coexisted with mob activity faced difficult choices. If you owned a business in a mob neighborhood, you might be approached for tribute, regular payments for protection. Refusing could mean vandalism, violence, or being driven out of business. Paying meant being complicit in extortion and funding criminal activity. Some business owners resisted and reported extortion to police, but many paid because they saw no alternative or because they knew police response would be ineffective. The police in New York had complicated relationship with the mob. Some police officers were corrupted. They took bribes, warned mobsters about investigations, or even participated in crimes. The police corruption scandals of the 1970s revealed extensive mob influence within NYPD, but most police officers weren't corrupt. They were frustrated by the mob's power and the difficulty of prosecuting connected criminals. The jurisdictional issues also complicated enforcement. Much organized crime crossed state lines and fell under federal rather than local jurisdiction. The prosecutors who took on mob cases were often ambitious attorneys who saw organized crime prosecution as career-making opportunity. Giuliani's prosecutions in the 1980s, when he was U.S. Attorney in Southern District of New York, made his reputation and launched his political career. But prosecuting mob required courage. Prosecutors received threats, had to provide security for their families, and knew that convictions could take years to achieve. The prosecutors who succeeded became famous, but many cases failed because witnesses recanted, evidence was suppressed, or juries were intimidated. The juries in mob trials faced intimidation and pressure. If you were selected for a jury in a mob case, you might have been approached, subtly or overtly, with suggestions about how you should vote. Jury tampering was common enough that some mob trials used anonymous juries where jurors' identities were protected. The intimidation was a real threat. Some jurors who voted to convict lived with fear afterward that they'd be targeted for revenge. The lawyers who defended mob clients ranged from ethical attorneys providing necessary legal representation to lawyers who were effectively part of the criminal enterprise. Some defense attorneys were house counsel for mob families. They knew the inner workings, helped structure criminal activity to avoid prosecution, and passed messages between imprisoned clients and the organization. These attorneys sometimes faced prosecution themselves for crossing the line from defense to participation in crime. The IRS investigations that targeted mobsters were often more successful than criminal prosecutions. The tax agents who examined mobsters' finances could prove income without proving the underlying crimes. You might have been acquitted of racketeering charges, but convicted of tax evasion because the government could show you spent more money than you declared in income. The civil asset forfeiture that accompanied tax cases could seize property even without criminal conviction. If property was purchased with unreported income, it could be forfeit to the government. The international connections that New York mob families maintained showed organized crime's global reach. The families had relationships with Sicilian Mafia, involved in heroin trafficking through the Pizza Connection, a network that imported heroin from Sicily and distributed it through pizza restaurants. The international drug trade generated enormous profits, but also attracted international law enforcement cooperation that made prosecution more likely and penalties more severe. The generational changes in attitudes toward the mob reflected broader social change. The first and second generation Italian immigrants who formed the base of mob families in the early 20th century came from an environment where organized crime and government corruption were normal in their home country. The government wasn't trusted. Police were seen as oppressors, and self-help through criminal organizations made sense. But third and fourth generation Italian Americans were acculturated Americans who had different relationship with authority and different opportunities for advancement. The decline in ethnic solidarity that had sustained mob recruitment meant that Italian-American neighborhoods no longer produced reliable stream of potential mobsters. The neighborhoods themselves changed. Gentrification dispersed Italian-American communities, intermarriage reduced ethnic identity, and economic mobility meant that Italian-Americans no longer lived in concentrated working-class areas. The social infrastructure that had supported the mob was disappearing. The question of whether organized crime could ever be completely eliminated is complicated. The mob has declined dramatically, but still exists. Other criminal organizations have filled some of the space the mob once occupied. The activities the mob engaged in, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, drug trafficking, continue under different management. As long as there's demand for illegal goods and services, there will be criminals organized to supply them. The specific form changes, but the underlying dynamics persist. The lessons from mob history about institutional corruption, the limits of law enforcement, and the social conditions that produce organized crime remain relevant. The mob thrived partly because legitimate institutions, police, unions, businesses, were corrupt or ineffective. It recruited from communities where legitimate opportunities were limited and where government wasn't trusted. It persisted because enforcement was reactive rather than preventive. These conditions still exist in various forms, creating opportunities for different types of organized crime. The nostalgia for mob era that some people express, the good old days when neighborhoods had order maintained by mob, ignores the violence and exploitation that order depended on. The mob did maintain certain kinds of order. Street crime was controlled in mob neighborhoods because independent criminals were driven out or recruited. But this order came at the cost of systematic extortion, corruption, and violence directed at anyone who challenged mob authority. It was authoritarian order, not community self-governance. The psychological question of why people are attracted to mob life, despite its obvious dangers, has complex answers. For some, it's economic. Mob life offered income that legitimate work didn't provide. For others, it's psychological. Mob offered belonging, identity, and respect that they couldn't find elsewhere. For still others, it's cultural. They grew up in an environment where mob life was normalized and saw it as natural path. The combination of economic incentive, psychological need, and cultural normalization made mob life appealing despite rational calculation suggesting it was bad choice. The few mobsters who achieved financial security and avoided prosecution are mostly those who left the life relatively early, or who focused on legitimate businesses while maintaining mob connections. These people were smart enough to recognize that mob life had expiration date and disciplined to prepare for exit, but they were tiny minority. Most mobsters stayed in the life until prison or death forced them out. The toll on neighborhoods where mob was strongest included not just direct victims, but also cultural damage. Young people growing up in these neighborhoods learned that violence was acceptable, that laws were to be circumvented, that success meant exploiting others. The normalization of criminality created multi-generational effects where children of mobsters and mob associates grew up with warped values. Breaking this cycle required conscious effort to reject the values and examples of previous generation. The Italian-American community's relationship with mob history is conflicted. Some Italian-Americans resent that organized crime has become central to Italian-American identity. In popular culture, they emphasize that the vast majority of Italian-Americans were never involved in crime. Others embrace mob history as part of ethnic heritage, celebrating the toughness and loyalty while downplaying the violence and exploitation. The tension between acknowledging historical reality and not wanting to reinforce stereotypes creates complicated conversations within the community. The reality for anyone considering whether to enter organized crime today is that it's almost certainly a bad decision by any rational calculation. The surveillance is omnipresent. The informants are everywhere. The sentences are severe, and the money isn't what it once was. The romantic notion of mob life has been thoroughly debunked by decades of prosecutions, turncoats, and exposés. The life that might have seemed attractive in 1950 or even 1980 is clearly a trap now. So the next time you watch a mob movie or show, The Godfather, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, and find yourself drawn to the camaraderie, the respect, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, remember the reality, the constant paranoia that your best friend might be ordered to kill you, the near certainty of prison or violent death, the families destroyed, the years wasted in criminal activity that generated temporary income but lasting damage, and the final realization that loyalty was a myth maintained only as long as it served someone else's interest. Being a mobster in New York wasn't an adventure but a trap. The initial attraction, money, respect, power, was real but temporary. The costs, violence, paranoia, prison death, were inevitable. The code of honor was selectively enforced, self-serving myth. The family loyalty was transactional and conditional. The sense of being special, of being part of secret society with its own rules, was intoxicating. But ultimately, you traded your freedom, and often your life, for the illusion of being someone important in a system designed to use and discard you. The courage some mobsters showed, refusing to cooperate, maintaining loyalty despite everything, was misplaced courage. It would have been braver to leave the life, to refuse to participate in violence, to break the cycle. The loyalty to criminal organization that was itself disloyal to its members was tragic misallocation of human capacity for devotion and sacrifice. The same people who showed such courage in the wrong cause could have achieved something worthwhile if they directed that courage toward legitimate goals. The legacy of mob era in New York is visible in multiple ways. The legitimate businesses that mob once controlled, waste management, construction, unions, underwent reforms but still deal with residual corruption. The neighborhoods where mob was strongest retain cultural memory even as demographics changed. The criminal justice reforms that emerged from mob prosecutions, RICO, wiretap laws, witness protection, remain central tools in fighting organized crime. The cultural products, movies, books, TV shows, continue to shape how Americans think about organized crime, Italian-American identity, and the nature of loyalty and betrayal. The individual mobsters who lived through the era and survived are now elderly men, many in prison, some in witness protection, a few living quietly under their own names. They carry the weight of their choices, the people they killed, the families they destroyed, the years they wasted. Some have expressed remorse, others maintain they'd do it all again. But regardless of their attitudes, they can't escape the reality that they spent their lives in service to criminal organizations that ultimately betrayed them or forced them to betray themselves. The question of whether mob life was ever a legitimate career choice is easy to answer now. It clearly wasn't. The apparent benefits were temporary and illusory. The costs were permanent and devastating. The few who profited did so at the expense of many who suffered. The system was designed to exploit members as much as victims. The code was myth. The loyalty was conditional, and the respect was based on fear rather than genuine esteem. But to young men growing up in mob neighborhoods in mid-20th century, without the benefit of hindsight and full information, the life could seem like rational choice. Understanding how people made those choices requires empathy for their circumstances, even while condemning their actions. The comparison between organized crime and legitimate business reveals uncomfortable parallels. Both involve hierarchies. Both reward ruthlessness. Both can involve exploitation. The difference is that legitimate business operates within legal constraints and doesn't employ murder as a management technique. But the psychological dynamics, the desire for status, the competition for advancement, the willingness to prioritize organization over personal ethics, aren't unique to criminals. Understanding mob psychology helps us understand human organizational behavior more broadly. The families who lost loved ones to mob violence, both the families of murdered victims and the families of mobsters who were killed or imprisoned, bear costs that statistics don't capture. The children who grew up without fathers because they were in prison or dead, the widows who struggled financially and emotionally, the parents who outlived their children because mob violence killed them young. These family members are victims of organized crime whose suffering continued for decades after the crimes themselves. The communities that were terrorized or exploited by mob activity also bear lasting costs. The small businesses that paid extortion for years and couldn't develop because profits were siphoned off. The union members whose pension funds were looted, the neighborhoods where violence was normalized. These collective harms affected thousands of people who had no direct connection to mob, but suffered its effects. The mob's impact extended far beyond its own members and immediate victims to shape entire communities' development. The law enforcement officers and prosecutors who spent careers fighting organized crime often paid personal costs. They worked long hours under stress, received threats against themselves and families, and saw years of work potentially undone by technicalities, corrupted witnesses, or jury tampering. Some became obsessive about their targets. sacrificing personal relationships for their work. The toll on law enforcement families, spouses who worried constantly, children who grew up with security concerns, is another cost of organized crime that's rarely discussed. The massive resources devoted to fighting organized crime over the decades, federal, state, and local law enforcement, prosecutors' offices, prisons, represent opportunity costs for society. The money and effort spent combating mob could have been used for other purposes if organized crime hadn't existed. This isn't argument against prosecuting criminals, but recognition that organized crime imposed enormous costs on society beyond the direct harm from specific crimes. The FBI's organized crime units, the special prosecutors, the extensive surveillance infrastructure, all of this was necessary response to mob power, but also represented resources diverted from other uses. The question of what we should learn from mob history has multiple answers. We learn that criminality isn't glamorous, but destructive. We learn that codes of honor among criminals are myths that crumble under pressure. We learn that law enforcement persistence can dismantle even powerful criminal organizations if given proper tools and resources. We learn that social conditions matter. Organized crime thrives in communities with limited opportunities, weak institutions, and cultural factors that normalize criminality. We learn that popular culture's romanticization of criminals can be dangerous when it influences young people's choices. The ultimate tragedy of mob life is that intelligent, capable men who could have contributed to society instead spent their lives destroying it and themselves. The organizational skills, the loyalty, the courage under pressure, these qualities are valuable and could have been directed toward legitimate accomplishments. Instead, they were wasted on criminal enterprise that enriched few, imprisoned many, and killed countless. The waste of human potential is perhaps the saddest aspect of mob history. All those lives that could have been productive and meaningful, but instead were consumed by violence, greed, and ultimately futility. For anyone who fantasizes about mob life based on movies and shows, the reality is this. You would almost certainly have ended up dead, in prison for decades, betrayed by people you trusted, addicted to drugs or alcohol, psychologically damaged from violence and paranoia, estranged from your family, and looking back on wasted years with regret. The few who avoided these fates did so through luck, betrayal of their associates, or getting out early, and even they carry the weight of what they did and saw. The life wasn't an adventure, but a slow-motion tragedy, where the outcome was predetermined, but the participants couldn't or wouldn't see it until too late. That is the truth about being a mobster in New York that no movie fully conveys and that you needed to hear. The mob in New York rose, dominated, and declined not because of individual failures, but because the system was unsustainable. It depended on secrecy that modern technology made impossible, loyalty that self-interest inevitably destroyed, and violence that eventually provoked overwhelming state response. And so ends our journey through mob life in New York. If you enjoyed this exploration of reality behind the mythology, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of mob life surprised you most, or suggest another topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler. And maybe tonight, appreciate that you don't have to watch every word you say in case it's being recorded, that your friendships aren't transactional relationships where betrayal is expected, that your employment doesn't involve violence or fear that you'll be murdered by your boss, that mistakes you make won't result in being killed, and that the ordinary struggles of legal work, however frustrating, don't include the certainty that you'll eventually be imprisoned or killed. Appreciate that glamorizing criminality in movies is entertainment that bears no resemblance to the brutal, paranoid, ultimately tragic reality of actual organized crime. Sweet dreams